Is sorted out. Thank you very much. Please do enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Well, I'm happy that the governor is here. He owns a printing press, so but whether he will agree that we must print more money. There's a river called Limpopo, and when you cross it, the sun is much more hotter that side. I don't know about the money. I saw Prof. Madaje here at the DVC, and Prof. Mokhalong.
VC, kukuta tanreta. Rasimokiana. VC, kukuta tanreta. Rasimokiana. When I was asked to come and talk here, ladies and gentlemen, I had picked a topic because I was told I am giving a lecture. And if you give a lecture, you do not talk about something that everybody knows. You pick up something that will get people interested. But with my team, we eventually decided that everybody might be talking about this and they might be knowing something about it, but they probably misunderstand it. And so we decided that I would talk about dealing with the high cost of living. It's good to be here. It's my first time in this school. I had been to the real campus. And the real campus is where the VC operates from. So if I want to see the VC, I can't come here. I have to drive that way so that I can see the VC. But the province is home to the baobab tree, a symbol of growth and adversity, amid adversity, which bears a stark resemblance to South Africa's domestic economic resilience. And this is despite the challenges we face. The province's own contribution to commodity exports has also helped South Africa withstand the headwinds to growth in recent years. Over the past 3 years, the global economy has endured multiple large and overlapping adverse supply shocks. This was at a time when the COVID-19 induced expansionary fiscal and monetary policies were firmly in place. This confluence of factors pushed global inflation to multi-decade highs, eroding real incomes and forcing consumers to make some difficult choices. Today, I want to talk about how the high cost of living has impacted households globally and relate it more specifically to how the typical South African consumer has fared. In doing so, I will discuss how the resilience of global demand has perpetuated high inflation and how global inflation has propagated into the domestic economy and how we, as the South African Reserve Bank, have responded to the inflation scourge. To provide context, I will begin by providing the global backdrop. Global inflation averaged 8.7% in 2022, its highest level in 40 years. The genesis of this inflation, was a confluence of factors, including supply chain pressures occasioned by the COVID-19 induced lockdowns and higher international food and energy prices brought about by Russia's war in the Ukraine. Expansionary fiscal and monetary policies meant to cushion economies from the ravages of COVID-19 pandemic inadvertently became accelerants to inflation as demand recovered faster amid constrained supply. Early in the recovery, consumption shifted to the less contact-intensive goods as mobility restrictions held back services consumption across the world. Goods consumption benefited from pent-up demand due to lockdowns as well as from the savings accumulated during the pandemic. Unfortunately, constrained supply chains could not cope with the sudden pickup in demand, and shortages of goods became the order of the day, which resulted in soaring goods prices globally. You may recall the shortage of microchips in 2021, which impacted the production of vehicles even in our own economy. Initially, inflation was thought to be transitory, meaning temporary. But it soon became clear it was anything but transitory. The sharply higher and more is, do we have a sharper one? At the height, provided a boost to the global economic momentum to the recent highs that we have seen compared to the forecast earlier. Demand, contact-intensive goods consumption at the height of the pandemic has rebalanced by rotating back to services as the COVID-19 pandemic has faded. Consequently, service-intensive economies such as the United States have shown strong growth so far in 2020. Persistence, particularly across Europe. Although global inflation peaked last year, its pace of decline has been much slower than expected, especially given the rapid pace of monetary policy normalization by the major global central banks. Global headline inflation has fallen from a peak of 9.4% in the third quarter of 2022 to 5.7% in the second quarter of 2023. Much of the decline in headline inflation has been due to lower international food and oil prices, which have fallen considerably as the uncertainty occasioned by Russia's war in the Ukraine has abated, as well as the normalization of supply chain pressures. Global headline inflation is projected to average 6.8% in 2023 from 8.7% in 2022. Measures of underlying inflation have, however, remained persistently high in major advanced economies, with core inflation declining more slowly. The rotation of demand from goods back to services that I alluded to earlier has also seen goods inflation slow markedly while pushing services inflation higher, meaning that the stickiness in core is largely a services inflation story. Several factors, including still elevated excess savings and unusually tight labor markets, especially in advanced economies, have also continued to support consumer demand and have possibly delayed the impact of rate hikes on aggregate demand. Complicating the disinflation efforts is that labor markets in advanced economies have remained unusually tight, which is likely to strengthen workers' bargaining power and drive real wage growth above productivity gains. Although long-term inflation expectations have remained anchored, headline inflation is expected to remain above the 2% target beyond 2020. So remains elevated in most emerging market economies, including here at home, and is expected to decline only gradually central bank's targets by 2025. Despite the recent moderation in headline inflation, risks tensions show no signs of abating, which will likely keep global food and energy markets tight, while the probability of El Niño weather conditions this year has risen sharply. Monetary policy is likely to remain focused on ensuring that inflation continues to retreat, implying that global policy rates should remain higher for longer. Now, let me turn my attention to developments in the domestic economy. How has the domestic economy fared? Like the rest of the world, South Africa has been grappling with persistently high inflation. South Africa has experienced a sustained inflation target breach, with headline inflation having remained above the midpoint of the target range for 27 consecutive months since May 2021. High inflation erodes what the rand can buy, and the Africans, alongside their global counterparts, have enjoyed a rise in the cost of living. This came at a time when South Africans had become accustomed to low and stable inflation. After hovering in the 6% inflation target range in May 2022 and reaching a high of 7.8% in July 2022 before beginning its retreat. The trajectory of domestic headline inflation has been shaped primarily by fuel, food prices. The first two have largely reflected global developments, beginning with the sharp rebound in the demand for goods and supply bottlenecks, and later exacerbated by Russia-Ukraine war, which further strained global energy and food prices. Sharply rising food and fuel prices raise fundamental concerns from in South Africa soared to 56.2% in July 2022 and pushed pump prices well above 25 rands per litre, with immediate knock-on effects on transport and production costs for goods and services. Meanwhile, high electricity tariffs have further raised the cost of living for many South Africans. Food and transport inflation impact the poor the most, as their consumption baskets are weighed heavily by these items. Recent inflation data by Statistics South Africa show inflation for the lowest income deciles, that is deciles 1 and 2, averaging 9% in January, while that for income deciles 9 to 10, that is the richest in our society, their inflation only averaged. Low income earners and the poor, more generally, are less able to protect their incomes from the authors of our Constitution understood the need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The Constitution tasks the South African Reserve Bank with of the rand, and we are committed to executing this mandate. In light of the deteriorating domestic inflation environment, the South African Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee raised the repo rate by a cumulative 475 basis points since the hiking cycle began in November 2021. In July, the committee will continue inflation developments and will act appropriately to steer inflation to the midpoint of the 3 to 6% target band, that is 4.5%, to create an environment conducive to balanced and sustainable economic growth in the interest of all South Africans. As food and fuel inflation going forward, we expect to see further moderation in headline inflation on the back of further declines in fuel and food inflation, as well as the cumulative effect increases to date. This should help ease the burden of high costs for both consumers and businesses. Inflationary pressures have, however, broadened within the core basket, in part reflecting spillover and second-round effects from the high fuel and food price increases the past year. Within the core basket, inflation has been driven mostly by core goods and to a less extent services. Housing, the largest services component, has experienced subdued inflation since the pandemic. This has helped to keep services inflation more muted and slowed the rise in core inflation. Core inflation is expected to average 4.9% this year. Risks to the domestic inflation outlook are on the upside. Although some food price components have eased over the past few months, domestic food price inflation is still elevated, while the risk of drier weather conditions in coming months has increased. Domestic food prices also remain at risk from exchange rate volatility, as well as the impact of geopolitical developments. Similarly, global oil markets remain tight, still elevated inflation expectations, which could feed into prices and wages, and thus providing impetus to core inflation. Before I conclude, let me briefly touch on the recent performance of the South African economy. Much like the global economy, the resilience of the domestic economy has surprised policymakers. After contracting by 6% in 2020, the domestic economy rebounded by 4.7% in 2021 and 1.9% in 2022. These growth rates were much stronger than we had expected and meant that the recovery to the pre-pandemic output level was achieved sooner than we had forecast. South Africa experienced large terms of trade gains as the global economy reopened following the COVID-19 lockdowns, underpinned by buoyant global commodities demands, while imports remained subdued. The strong domestic recovery also reflected a very supportive domestic macroeconomic environment with massive fiscal support and multi-decade low interest rates. With output now back to its pre-pandemic level, South Africa's medium-term economic outlook has weakened sharply again, this time on the back of extensive load shedding. Expectations were broadly for the domestic no growth in 2023 and only modest growth over the medium term. The domestic economy, however, is again likely to surprise on the upside this year with a projected, albeit subdued, growth of 0.4% following better than expected growth outturn in the first quarter of 2023. Figures released by Statistics South Africa at 11 o'clock this morning show that growth once again surprised on the upside, and actually it grew by 0.6% in the second quarter on economic activity and will remain a drag on domestic growth in the near term. The SARB estimates that load shedding will shave up to 2 percentage points this year if it was not for load shedding. Let me put the challenges of load shedding into perspective. We have seen more load shedding in the past 6 months of 2023 than for the whole of 2022. Load shedding is having broader effects on the cost of doing business, and ultimately the cost of living for all South Africans. Encouragingly, though, we are beginning to see some traction on reforms, particularly in the energy sector. While some strides have been made in removing structural barriers to entry for independent energy producers, the full benefits of these interventions will mostly materialize in the medium to long term. The SARB sees both potential growth and output growth slightly higher over the medium term. Meanwhile, private sector investment in alternative energy is providing a welcome boost to fixed capital formation and is supporting domestic economic activity, particularly in the construction industry. Investment explains the resilience we see in the economy. Despite high inflation eroding real incomes, household spending has grown over the past year, although its contribution to overall economic growth has been declining. High inflation and rising interest rates, alongside slower employment recovery and declining real disposable income, continue to weigh on consumer confidence, raising the prospect of further slowdowns in household consumption growth. Slower domestic growth ultimately reflects in weaker fiscal numbers, especially so given the reversal in revenue windfalls. The current trajectory of the fiscus is characterized by elevated budget deficits and rising public debt levels. This has contributed to a higher risk premium, driving up the cost of borrowing and the exchange rate, thereby raising exchange rate pass-through to inflation. Fiscal consolidation can economic growth. Finally, let me conclude by recommitting the South African Reserve Bank to the challenge posed by our Constitution. Our job is to contain inflation in the interest of balanced and sustainable. That job is not done yet. The SARB will continue to execute its mandate to keep demand and supply in the economy in balance. By so doing, we play our part in creating an environment conducive to inclusive and sustainable economic growth for the benefit of our people. It is important, however, to realize that economic growth and development really is a team sport, and as such, needs all the players to pull together well. So while we work hard to lower inflation and interest rates to support a healthy balance of saving and investment, it is critical that the broader public sector identifies constraints to growth. This concludes my remarks, and I am looking forward to a very robust engagement with you.
Governor, thanks so much. I was seeing a flashing headline tomorrow in the newspapers, but more critically, that the governor of the Reserve Bank, while reading his MPC statement at TGSL, announced a particular rate. But I think you will agree with me that the topic around dealing with high cost of living has sufficient to do a bit of a response to what the governor has just said. Professor Komai is the director of the School of Economics in the Faculty of Management and Law at the University of Limpopo. Prof. Komai.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My special greetings to our esteemed guests, colleagues, students, friends, the University of Limpopo executive leadership at large, and members of the public. It is a great honor and privilege to serve as a respondent to the address by Governor Mr. Kganyago. titled Dealing with the High Cost, Professor Mokoena, the director of the Teflop Graduate School of Leadership, which is one of the leading business schools in the country, for this invitation. I appreciate this rare opportunity. Program Director, Professor Matebula, allow me to make input on the address delivered by Governor Mr. Kganyago by firstly giving him accolades for the sterling work he's doing at the central bank, albeit with enormous difficulties. Governor, I reckon you barely receive, including businesses, informed by the crucial responsibility and obligation vested upon you and the bank in terms of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, 1996, specifically Section 224. I am pleased and encouraged by the fact that you are in possession of the prestigious Senior Management Development Certificate you obtained from the Harvard Kennedy School, and thus enabling you to straddle the two worlds of commerce and government with relative ease. You have adeptly excelled in both worlds, and you continue to demonstrate this art of leadership to this day par excellence. First and foremost, when the collapse of VBS came to the fore and caught public attention, the Reserve Bank, under your leadership, sanctioned a forensic investigation that resulted into the publication of a report titled The Great Bank Heist. It is common cause that VBS was liquidated and regrettably depriving multitudes of ordinary rural folks with access to banking. We have since observed consequence management meted out against several senior executives, political office bearers, private individuals, and companies involved in this great bank heist, arising from glaring financial misconduct and deliberate disregard of the law, specifically the Municipal Finance Management Act 56 of 2003, plus the 1 point municipal investments lost to VBS, flagged as material irregularity by the Auditor General. This is commendable. 6 June 2019, during an Investec gathering held in Johannesburg, you expressed that the continuing attacks on the central bank was akin to the arrival of barbarians at the gate. You argued that state institutions have been systematically weakened and gutted. However, you implored South Africans to stand up for institutions. The final report of the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, dubbed the Zondo Commission, released in 2022, evidently attests to the fact that there were concerted efforts and attempts made to weaken and capture state institutions to achieve narrow, selfish, and nefarious gains by a select few. This, again, affirms your principal stance against state capture. More disturbing was the release of the Public Protector Report in 2017, containing a remedial action for the amending of the Constitution pertaining the mandate of the central bank. The release of this report triggered a sale of 1.3 billion rand South African government bonds by non-resident investors, and thus effectively causing a serious harm to the country's economy. Honestly, and correctly so, Governor, the barbarians you alluded to nearly passed through the gate of the central bank if it were not for your courageous leadership and that of your colleagues at the bank by launching an urgent court application with the High Court in Pretoria, seeking the review and also the setting aside of the remedial action by the Public Protector that sought to amend Section 224 of the Constitution, regulating the object of the central bank and its mandate. It is common cause that the Constitutional Court in 2019 vindicated the action taken by the bank and reaffirmed its constitutional independence. In the midst of all these developments and destructive actions, you stood firm, principled, and decisive, thus living up to the maxim that leadership is about vision, integrity, and courage. I know that my colleagues here at TGSL focuses on the issue of leadership in their MBA and MPhil, developing a leadership case study about South Africa's greatest son, Governor Mr. Kganyago, as part of imparting and embedding knowledge to a generation of students yearning for a decolonized and African-centered higher education in the country, in the continent of Africa, and the globe. By the way, this was one of the demands that formed part of the Fees Must Fall movement in 2015. This demand remains relevant to this day. Turning to the crux of the topic, Governor, it is pertinent at this stage to bring the following salient issues to your attention. The country invariably experiences sporadic protests and national shutdowns as part of raising the plight of the masses living in deplorable conditions and struggling to make ends meet. In October 2022, both COSATU and SAFTU, the biggest labor federations in the country, embarked on a national protest regarding electricity crisis and affordability against Eskom and the city of Joburg. Subsequently, the Tembisa Township residents in the city of Ekurhuleni embarked on a similar protest pertaining the rising cost, expressed that the rising cost of living is deepening poverty and inequality. In addition to these civil unrests, numerous communities throughout the country continue to face harsh economic realities and thus employ protest as a mechanism to express and register their displeasure and plead for interventions from state. Is perceived as a country that is on the brink of collapse, and thus it is a country that is flagged with a sign of elevated warning. In uprising akin to the engulfed, the 2021 July unrest stands on record as the most expensive riot, costing 50 billion rands in economic output. These protests, Governor, are justified since empirical evidence confirms that about 8.6 million households live on less than 2,340 rands per month. These households do not have to pay for a basic basket of nutritious food. Every rand that they spend on municipal services is taken from their food requirements. Clearly, these 8.6 million households are unable to pay for municipal services. Under no circumstances, therefore, should the current cost of basic services, that is water and electricity, in this situation is that municipal services have become an instrument of impoverishing even further the poorest South African households and entrenching inequality. Empirical evidence points out that communities experience poor quality and unreliable services in many municipalities living within the prism of a failing state, in other words, a fragile state. However, the sixth administration has introduced and implemented a raft of economic reforms and strategies aimed at reviving the country's economy following the 2018 economic recession that unprecedentedly spent the first 2 quarters of the year. Furthermore, the introduction of the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan in 2021 provides an impetus to stimulate and reposition the South African economy and propel it into higher growth and investment rates. What needs to be done? Clearly, there's no magic wand in resolving this problem. We need trade-offs, rational and pragmatic policy choices, and commitment, as the governor said, a teamwork from social partners across the board, namely government, business, labor, and community as part of forging social compact. A, the International Monetary Fund, IMF 2023 report, projects a 2% economic growth rate for our country, however, with a caveat that if Eskom and Transnet are fixed, prospects are there that the economy is likely to grow as part of the post-COVID-19 economic recovery trajectory. B, municipalities must settle the 63 billion rand debt they owe as not to implement the 18% electricity tariff it was granted by NESA. Secondly, Soweto residents have since made the commitment to pay at least 100 rands per month as part of settling the 5 billion rand debt they owe Eskom. $1 million question is, if Eskom is directed again to defer implementing a new electricity tariff in 2023 to 2024, who will bear the pain of the consumer in 2025 when Eskom will possibly be freed to effect a tariff hike? We cannot afford to have short-termism without looking into long-term implications of the policy decisions taken by state institutions in the interim. C, part of easing the burden of consumers regarding the hefty electricity bill, the National Treasury introduced new incentives regime in April 2023 for rooftop solar installations for both businesses and households. There is a reduction of tax liability for companies who invest in solar energy equipment that is tied to the grid. Similarly, there is a reduction of tax liability for households. It provides for licensing exemption from NESA for generation of 100 megawatts from solar energy. D, the review of the local government funding framework is long overdue. The assumptions made in the 1998 white paper on local government no longer obtain 73% of its own revenue. In December 2020, a special Lekgotla of the Budget Forum resolved that National Treasury, National COGTA, and SALGA should review the local government fiscal framework. This process is yet to materialize, facing majority of South Africans. A state that adequately drives the implementation of economic transformation in favor of the economically marginalized, disadvantaged, and excluded citizens. I thank you.
Response. Colleagues, we are not going to waste time. We do have a rather compressed time. The governor does have to leave very quickly, and we will promptly end this conversation at about 10 to 3. And there must be mics somewhere, but if there is no mic, I will come to you. Can I take the first set of questions? I do think that your voice is big enough, huh?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Matlodi Daniel Rapiri from one of the finest universities in the country. So, Mr. Governor, from the speech, it was very powerful, hence my mind drew questions. So, one of the questions that I have is that what is learned in terms of changing the banking landscape? And again, as the Reserve Bank, how or plan in terms of launching a new black bank? And also in terms of the long-term inflation, which remains elevated, to quote your words. So what is your plan in terms of transforming the South African economy? Because I really don't understand why there was a change in terms of, and how was it strategic in terms of developing the economy? And lastly, I would like to extend my gratitude to everyone in the room, and thank you.
Thanks so much. Next hand. Oh, there's a hand here. To you if you have a question in the meantime.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Naledi Pila. I'm currently doing my first year Masters in Economics. Mr. Governor, I have a question. Since ESCOM has implemented stage 6, you said something about load shedding cause inflation to rise, or to say the poor to remain poor. Therefore, the question says that if ESCOM is load shedding is here to stay, it's not going anywhere, are there measures to tackle the inflation to go up, or rather to say to save the poor so that they can have the means to afford their basket? Thank you.
There's a question this side.
Thank you. Governor, I'm a big fan of yours, so it was lovely to listen to you. I just want to know that you didn't speak about this topic, but if the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement could be implemented and South Africa could trade more with other African states, do you think that would have an impact on inflation? And, well, I think it would have an impact on economic growth because probably more jobs will be created, but do you think it will have an impact on the inflation rate? Sorry? Oh, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Gerda van Niekerk and I'm from the Rio campus. Thanks.
Wow, there's shades there. There's a real campus and the other campus.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mashabat Golani, doing my first year in public masters. My question is based on the recently concluded BRICS summit. In 2021, the top partner countries include Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Oman, United Arab Emirates, and India. So with the inclusion of United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia with effect from 2024 January in BRICS, which has been announced in the recently concluded BRICS summit. I want to know, Kore, these countries are top fuel producers, and now they are part of BRICS, which South Africa is part of. How is South Africa going to benefit in terms of the reduction in fuel prices? As we know, Kore, tomorrow midnight there will be a fuel price hike. So how will these inclusions of it's not okay. How is the inclusion of those countries that we import fuel from in BRICS going to help South Africa in terms of fuel prices going forward?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much, Governor, for a good presentation. My question is actually based on the fact that during COVID-19, it was indicated that it was business unusual. Check from the perspective of the Reserve Bank as to, would it have been prudent maybe also to consider changing the target rate from 4% to 8%? So that instead of you increase prices the moment, obviously, when you hit the top of the range, and effectively the middle class, in terms of their bond, in terms of their cars, they no longer have disposable income, which then affect some people who might be working for them, who would be something that...
And even contraction, and then after that the economy rebounded as it opened. So a Great Depression is not in the mix. Now you said that the president of the US closed the banks. No. That becomes a very interesting. It's called the National Payment System. We guard that national payment system jealously. We have got backup of a backup of a backup, and we put them in different towns so that if there is a disaster in one town, the system will continue to work. Why is it so important? If that system collapses, your credit card, you will not be able to withdraw money. You will not be able to effect payments. Your EFT will not work. Nothing works because the backbone of that is the national payment system. It is run from the South African Reserve Bank, and it's a very important part of our work. And that is why it's the central banks that are tasked with ensuring that the financial system. In grants, we expanded the South African Reserve Bank banknote factory, and then we print the money. Fortunately, these days there are more sophisticated ways. You don't have to come and queue at the Reserve Bank for your share of the money. We will just put it into your bank account. Everyone is happy. Everybody can afford the food. Problem solved. Well, there is a president who, when he was told his government had run out of money, he asked them, what do you mean have run out of money? Have you run out of paper or have you run out of ink? Yeah. That was President Idi Amin. What he didn't understand was that they printed so much money that there was so much money chasing such few goods that the money was worthless. He was not the only one. It happened in Germany that they printed so much money. And I'm sure Professor Kwama would have taught you, those who are doing the master's program, that the inflation got so high in Germany that you needed to carry money in wheelbarrows to go and buy very basic things. And this chap arrived with a wheelbarrow at a shop to buy bread. And he put the wheelbarrow there, and then he took the first bunch of money to go and buy the bread to say, I'm going to fetch more money. When he came out of the shop, he found the money lying on the floor. They stole the wheelbarrow. The reason the wheelbarrow was now worth more than, they were basically saying to him, rather take the wheelbarrow and leave you with your money. So that situation leads to what is called hyperinflation. Tlangani in his well-schooled diplomacy said that once you cross the Limpopo, it gets very hot that side, but their money is not that hot. And the institution, the creation of an institution whose sole task will be to protect the value of the money so that it is worth more than the wheelbarrow. And so that institution is the South African Reserve Bank. And so our job is to protect the value of the money. Those banknotes and coins that you have are nothing but a piece of paper or a piece of metal. When inflation enters through the door, public trust jumps out through the window, those pieces of paper and your metals become worthless, like the ones left outside that store in Germany, and the wheelbarrow carrying the money was gone. So inflation erodes the buying power of money, and see then what actually happens. It is something that could sound politically appealing because you could just give everybody that amount of money, and as it so happens, afterwards you discover that the money is worthless, and at least 3 in SADC, which their citizens will not accept their currency. You go there and you want to pay in their currency, the people will not take the money. So I was at a hotel called Pelatuna, attending a meeting in Luanda, and we had exchanged money and we had their local currency. And then one of my colleagues said, guys, we can't live with this, do with this amount of money. Anybody wants drinks? I said, I'm going to buy all of you drinks. Bought us drinks and then put the money in there to settle the money. And the guy, the waiter, came and said the bill, and he brought us the change, and the change was also still this big. And then we said, no, that's your tip, you can take it. He took that wallet and dropped the notes on our table, and he left. What was he telling us? Don't give me that money, it's worthless, comes our neck. And the question asked about changing the banking landscape and launching of what is the Reserve Bank doing to launch a black bank? We don't launch banks. Put together a business plan, go onto the Reserve Bank website, get the application process, engage with your auditors who will certify that your business plan is viable, submit an application. We will ask you to come and talk to us. We will ask you lots of questions. We will ask you whether you have systems to run a bank and whether you have got people who have a knowledge on how to run a bank, voila, you have got a banking license. So don't ask us to reserve bank. I said for many of these things is a team play. And so a group of good South Africans met in 2002 and adopted what they called the Financial Sector Charter. That Financial Sector Charter set particular targets, not just for banking, for the entire financial sector, and set transformation targets in with respect to the sector. And it is that the performance that they have against those targets, and that is what you actually need to be looking at in evaluating the transformation of the banking landscape. Last thing, we are so obsessed with ownership in your pocket right now. Would you know? And do you know why? It's because there is none. The way in which you raise capital is to find as many people as possible to invest in your business. Plan for a company, and because the investors believe in it, they put money in it. So if you are going to create a bank, the Bank of Limpopo, and you say only people from Limpopo can invest in it, you have already cut out millions of South Africans who might have believed in your thing to invest in it. And if you decide to establish a bank and says only people with small noses or big ears can invest in this bank, well, you will cut yourself away from capital. The changing of banknotes, we change banknotes frequently, and we are not the only ones, and it has got nothing to do with economic development. In case you didn't know, let me tell you now. The South African Reserve Bank has got a monopoly. We are a legal monopoly. We are the only ones who are allowed to print banknotes and coins. We are also the only ones who can destroy them. We are the only ones who are allowed to write on the banknotes and coins. So don't you, when you are bored, write on your banknotes, because if we catch you, we will lay a charge against you. Yes, you will be charged. So we protect the note is torn, is dirty, and feels like it's mushy and not crisp. The banks, when you take it to the bank will take that banknote, they will send it to us, we will destroy it, and we will give them a French banknote. Why? Because it is important that the quality of those banknotes is also appealing to you. Now, they, unlike you and I, they shouldn't work. And they think that banknotes that look like ours, that carry our name, we call them counterfeiters. And we always have to be a step ahead of them. So we upgrade our banknotes so often, and we incorporate into the banknotes what we call security features that make it difficult for the counterfeiters to reproduce. You will have a total blackout. Load shedding is there to protect the grid from collapse. So load shedding is a way of rationing electricity. You can only have so much between this time and this time, or between this time and this time you will not have it. That is what it is. Unfortunately, the load shedding is supposed to be a temporary intervention whilst you bring in more power on stream. And unfortunately for South Africa, temporary has been very long. That temporary has been running since 2008. And here is the story. So in 2008, India and China and South Africa were experiencing serious electricity shortages. This is what happened. India went out and built lots of power stations. So did China. What did South Africa do? We did what we are very good at. We called a national electricity summit to discuss the problem. So whilst we were discussing the problem was getting worse, And eventually we got round to building the power station, and it was clear that we will have to catch up. And meanwhile, there are other power stations collapsing because they are too old, and so forth. Dealing with these things require decisiveness. I had said many of these things are a team sport, but even in a team sport, there must be the team leader who is able to command the whole team to do that. I leave it at that. I'm not going any further. In terms of the electricity, I mean, for many of the people, there is the free basic electricity. There is a fiscal intervention. It's not a central bank intervention. Where the central banks comes in is they say that they are losing goods because of load shedding. It becomes difficult for us, and they spread that thing, inflation, economy, and we have got to deal with that, and that is our job. The African Continental Agreement, there is no doubt there are massive benefits. The World Bank has estimated that by 2035, if the African Free Trade Agreement, as agreed, is implemented vigorously, and you deal with the constraints about the movement of goods across the realized, more sophisticated economy, we tend to benefit more from intra-African trade than many of the other African countries. And as a matter of fact, we run trade surpluses with the rest of the continent, meaning we are selling to those countries than we are buying from them. And part of the thing about Africa, why we end up not trading so much with each other, is that we tend to produce the same things. And many of the African economies are very much driven by commodities, and we have got to be able to diversify our economies to trade more. Fuel prices, the countries are in BRICS because they are pursuing their interests. They are not there because they are friends. Countries do not have friends. Countries only have permanent interests. And so, you think that that country is your friend, and the voters in that country change the political leaders. The political leaders have got a different mandate, and they look elsewhere. So, pursuing our own interests. I am talking like that because I am a technocrat. If you ask the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Foreign Affairs will say that we are interacting with our friends, we have got cordial relationships and fraternal relationships. That is their job, right? We are technocrats. We look at the numbers. We look at the numbers. So don't think that because now Saudi Arabia is in BRICS is going to sell South Africa oil cheaper. Why should they do that if they can sell it at a better price somewhere? They are not going to do that, right? They might give you access, but you are going to pay the world price for that. The question raised, business unusual during COVID? Yes, it was during COVID, and we had to do things. If you think everything that was being done during COVID must be done now, do you want us to bring back the lockdown? No. The lockdown was there to deal with COVID. The steps that the central banks took then was to deal with COVID. And we cannot continue on those steps. It was business unusual, and that is why you will find the language talking about normalizing things. China reopening. China getting rid of its zero COVID policy. Precisely because we are trying to return the world to normal, and when it returns to normal, we will do the normal things. And you asked the question, did we consider increasing the inflation target during COVID? Not at all. You know, I don't know, there are lots of people, and you can't judge people by their looks and say how old they are. But you see, Professor Moghalong, I know that he is at least 70. I know that because he had told me at least 7 years ago, every year that next year he is retiring. So he has got a lot of memory. And for those who were privileged enough to have mortgages then, memory. And I will forgive all of you who are students, because you wouldn't know what interest rates in South Africa were in 1987. They equal 1.5%. Why? Because inflation in South Africa was also roughly 21%. And for those now that post-apartheid, jog your memories back to 1998. Inflation in South Africa rose to like 15, 16%. And where did interest rates go? 25.5%. I'm sure by now you get the drill. Come 2020, inflation is 3%. Where were interest rates? 3.5%. Get the gist? Higher inflation necessitates higher interest rates. If you want lower interest rates, you must have lower, would give the price setters an impression that we do not care about inflation. And very soon, to restore that credibility, you will end up having to increase interest rates to try and restore the credibility, not a place you want to be. If South Africa has to have lower interest rates, South Africa has got to have lower inflation. In an environment where you have higher inflation, nobody wants to save. Why should I save? Because I save my money, and tomorrow the goods are costing me more. I could as well just go and spend the money, and then you end up in a spiral. Somebody said that the BRICS summit decided one central bank, one currency, one governor. And I just want to say to you upfront, I do not intend to be a BRICS governor. So you know. That was not the decision of the summit. The decision of the summit said that we must reduce our dependence on the dollar, and we must also our own currencies. And so, but the Freudian slip you've had becomes very important, because you said one central bank, one currency, one governor. That is exactly the point. If you are to have a BRICS currency, you need one central bank to issue that currency. You are going to need a governor to be at the head of that central bank. But we have just expanded BRICS from 5 to 11. How will you have one central bank that has got 11 monetary policies? That basically means they must also have one monetary policy. That means that we are still very far from having these things. What have we been doing as central bankers from BRICS member countries? What we have been doing was to put in place a mechanism for us to settle trade in our own currency and promote the use of our own currencies. The country most advanced that was quick off the mark was China. It established the RMB Clearing Center in Johannesburg and designated Bank of China to be responsible for that clearing center. They put a swap line between the People's Bank of China and the South African Reserve Bank. It's a cross-currency swap, which means that if the People's Bank of China runs out of rands, they can ask us for the rands. We will give them the rands. They give us the renminbi. If we run short of RMB and we want the RMB, we will give them rand and they will give us RMB, and the thing continues like that. So that system is going to be replicated amongst the BRICS member countries so that we can settle in our currencies. That is what we do as technocrats. The other stuff you talked about is very political, and I would leave it there for the politicians to deal with. Other tools to tackle inflation. Well, they said that the interest rate is a blunt tool, and I said, are there sharper ones that people can give us. We do have other tools. They are as blunt as the repo rate. Part of it is that they are not very transparent, so they hurt you, but you do not quite see that they are hurting you. You will still feel the same pain as you feel with interest rate, except you will not know where it is coming from. Okay? So what do we have in our toolkit? So we have got the repo rate. We have got what we call reserve requirements. And when they deposit the money, still get exactly the same thing. 3 is a tool that costs so much pain. And all of these tools you deploy depending on the economic circumstances at that particular point in time. So when inflation reached 0 and interest rates reached 0 in the advanced economies deployed what is called quantitative easing. And Professor Koma, when prices no longer work, we then use quantities because it is the prices that are supposed to equilibrate this. And so some chaps in South Africa thought this is a cool idea. We can also do it. And they said, no. Can't do it in South Africa because inflation is not 0 and interest rates are not 0. The 4th instrument looks like quantitative easing, but it is not quantitative easing, is the asset purchases and sales of assets to stabilize the financial markets. So we deployed those in 2020 to stabilize the of the market. So we do that. Those tools are all available, but they are not appropriate tools at this juncture. The appropriate tool at this juncture is the repo rate. That deals with all the questions.
So, Governor, you have answered the questions. 3 of the questions you answered included questions that are online from people that are streaming online. I wanted to ask for last 2 questions to close, but I can't see you, and you can blame the governor for talking about load shedding, and then now we have load shedding. Right? I didn't realize that somebody's much more darker than me.
Where's the hand?
There he is. Just last 2 questions.
2 questions? I have 5. I have 6. I have 6 questions. 1.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, I'd love to believe, or rather state that a person in South Africa, as a citizen, is allowed to keep equal or less than 25,000 rand in cash, right? I'm correct if I'm wrong. So, yeah, where they found millions in dollars, a foreign currency in land of the country, right? So my questions are, how is he not found guilty and charged for keeping large amounts of money and foreign currency for that fact? And what does he have that guards him or renders him the privilege not to endure consequences like everyone else? Also, were those funds taxed? And can I, if I have political influence like Cyril Ramaphosa, get away with such a similar case? Wait, relax. Right? And also, the South African Reserve Bank as a state entity, right? I want to pose this question, but I know you're going to answer it in a way, that is favorable to you, but is the South African Reserve Bank and the South African Reserve Bank governor accountable, or rather,
corrupt itself as a state entity? Okay. Those are my questions. I'm sorry if they, I mean, I'm sorry if they sound impudent or anything rather, but please.
No, don't worry. We are at the university. You are allowed to ask questions. The only difficulty is when we have run out of time, you have very little time to preach. I'm looking for ladies. Yeah, you are going to be the last person to ask the question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Governor. Well, mine is simple. I just, I'm Priscilla Mahova. I'm doing masters. I'm from the Real Campus too. I just want to understand what can one do with uncirculated coins. Well, I was gifted uncirculated coins from the South African Reserve Bank, so I want to understand what I can do with them. Thank you.
Governor, I think those are the questions that needs to be responded to. I'm not going to add to that. We have run out of time.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong. Financial Intelligence Center Act doesn't prohibit you from having any amount of money. Not at all. All it says is, when that money is deposited in a bank, the bank must file a suspicious transaction. And once it has got that, filed that suspicious transactions, the law enforcement authorities must take it from there. If the law enforcement authorities find that there is something for you to explain, you will have to explain. That is what the financial intelligence sector does, not the South African Reserve Bank. You asked specifically about Phala. We have pronounced on this, and let me be clear. So the first question you asked was that question that has to do with suspicious transactions, possible money laundering and all of that. We don't investigate that. That's somebody else's job. It's the intelligence sector and the Hawks. Was the money taxed? There are two forms of taxes. The money was a foreign currency. When the foreign currency comes into the country, it must be declared at the port of entry. When it gets declared at the point of entry, you declare it be declared at the point of entry. If you are a foreigner and you have got the foreign currency, there are no exchange control applicable to you. You can come in with the money. And then at some point you will have to transact. Normally it would happen at a hotel, but they will give you a transaction of the Currency and Exchanges Act, or the Exchange Control Regulations, state that when South Africans transact must receive payment other than in the rand. They must receive the payment in foreign currency because they are exporting. There was a reason why that was done. The underlying reason was very simple. The quickest way to take money out of the country was to say to somebody, you can give me the dollars wherever. Regulation 6.1 of the same regulations states that once you are entitled to foreign currency, such foreign currency must be declared to an authorized dealer. Our finding is clear. People might not like our finding because they think that we should have investigated everything. No, not going to investigate everything. I investigate in accordance accordance with the legislation that I administer. To the extent that the others had seen that there are other things taking place there, their job is to investigate those things. So, SARS made their pronouncement about customs, the violation of exchange control. Next would be that Hawks and FIC must make a pronouncement about the cash and whatever. Not for us. And I am cognizant that South Africans hold the Reserve Bank in such high regard. And because we have done so much for the country, you just keep on expecting us to do more and more. But we can't do for you, South Africans, what we are not empowered to do in terms of the law. We can only utilize tools and instruments that are available to do things that they might have or might have not done, or they might have done and not done correctly. That is not for us to pronounce. So I worry that in the same manner that you were asking this thing, why haven't we done these things? Other people ask, you guys, you are always talking about why don't you do something for agriculture? Why don't you do something for jobs? Why don't you do something for this and that? And so you expect, you have been so good tackling inflation, you surely can also be good. And I worry that society has got an inflated expectation of what central banks can do. Central banks have got a remit given by society, and that is what we are tasked with, and we have got to live through to that mandate, which brings me to your next question, the accountability of the South African Reserve Bank. Plan in Parliament, and we go there and explain to Parliament what we have done, and that is accountability. But we take it further. We engage in fora like this, where you know you are in a university space and your academic freedom is guaranteed, and you can ask any question in the pursuit of knowledge. Your academic freedom is protected. You can ask any of those questions, and we will respond to you in accordance with our mandate, because society expects nothing less of us. We hold what we call monetary policy forums. We go across provinces. We send people out there to account to South Africans what is it that we are doing. We take it further. We run what is called the MPC Schools Challenge, where we get high school learners to constitute the difficulty that we go through in arriving at our decisions, and we give them resources to do that. And the universities support them, and I challenge all the seats in the MPC Schools Challenge. And we have had this thing now, it covers the entire country, and you know, one of the schools that came out in the top 10 a couple of years ago, 4 years or so ago, was a school outside Mount. Very credible case on where policy with respect to monetary policy should go, and they were able to do that. So that is everything. Corruption, if you have any inkling of whether as an institution or officials of the bank, there is a line, an anti-corruption line, whistleblowing line we call it, that is outside of the Reserve Bank, is run by an audit firm that had actually been reported through that line. And that is the reason we do that, is because society holds the Reserve Bank in such high regard that and if you bring that old brown 1 rand note.
Up the TGSL leadership conversations for this time around. The next conversation will be with the Auditor General here on the 20th of September. Professor Mkwena, say your say, and then they.
Well, Thank you very much, and to you all. I think I'm given less than 2 minutes here because of as quick as possible. Mine is to extend a vote of thanks. Because of time, please, colleagues, and students, thanks to all of you. From the we really, as a school, within the Faculty of Management and Law, thank you so much for making time to come and, engage with the governor. But I will be doing injustice if I don't actually. Mr. Governor, thank you very much for making time from your busy schedule to come and educate Professor Mokgalong. And I think I noted some also members of the executives. I also want to thank the DVC to access it. Then he says to me, no. Actually, the invite did not come through the email, it came through WhatsApp. And I said, oh, okay. You used it, but thank you very much, Professor Singh. You just right at the back there, our DVC research partnership, research innovation and partnership. I also want to thank my special colleague here, the director of school at the Limpopo, the city of Polokwane, then the province and the country will be empowered. I noted actually online, program director, I'm going to sit now, that there were quite a number of systems who also actually joined us. And I also noted some institutions as well from the public sector, Auditor General South Africa, and where it was, if online and physical, and also EduPark management and the support staff and everybody, communication and so forth. We
Prof. Mokgalong, because they need to take interviews with SABC outside, which is time-based. So you're welcome to take leave of absence, Governor, and Prof. Mokgalong only, and Mr. Rachidi. But for two ladies, please step up. And these ladies are going to be performing in the talent that the University of Limpopo does have. You will be amazed. But other than that, colleagues, we'll see you on the 20th of September in this.
Waiting to be on the way, and in many homes there are voices crying of Jesus by hills and waters. God bless Africa and her sons and daughters.